All right. Thank you so much for being here today. I'm really excited to see you. I know we last saw each other. Was that August last
Oh
year?
my God. I think
Was it
it was,
August?
I think it was because it
Yeah,
was hot.
it was hot. I hope that someone was saying that they were going to move it. We
Yeah,
met at the Mississippi Book Festival. Someone said they were going to move it to a later date because, yeah, that heat was,
it was a lot. I
it was
remember signing
something.
books with Tyreek and we
Hmm.
would just just sweat.
Just miserable. But I'm really happy that you're able to come
Yeah.
and sit and talk with us today. As I remembered reading what happened to Ruthy Ramirez, I was thinking about this idea of stories and who gets to tell them. And from knowing you, it seems like so much of your identity is in this book. Was that something that you felt was important to you prior to writing?
Well, I was thinking a lot about Puerto Rican voices and stories and storytelling, and of course, the history of colonization, right, colonialism, and what that's done to writers in the diaspora, yes, but also in the archipelago, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, so there are for decades, yeah, I mean, since the Jones Act, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
Puerto Rican voices have, been marginalized, oppressed, or just overlooked,
Yeah.
right? And so there were times in which you saw these moments where they surfaced, like the 70s, 80s, like Miguel Piñero, those guys were getting some play. And then it kind of disappeared for a little bit, and
Mm-hmm.
it's very strange because I think I published this book at a moment when there's so many Puerto Rican voices. When they used to it used to be very hard to find a novel written by a Puerto Rican author in the Big Five.
Mm-hmm.
But then there's Jennifer Maritza Macaulay, for
Mm-hmm.
example, right? Like Melissa Cosequino, Justin Torres won the National Book Award.
Yep.
Like this was, yeah, it's like you never that never happens.
Right.
Like, and so I feel really honored to be writing at this moment.
Mm-hmm.
And Jennifer Maritza Macaulay is a good friend, and so we call each other. Like she texted me, congratulated me, about getting longlisted, and then we often are, we saw each other at the Miami Book Festival, and we sat
Mm-hmm.
down and we're like, it's so crazy that we're here, and it's
Yeah.
like, so yeah, I think that shapes a lot of the book, because there's an awareness. I think that this book is really about storytelling.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I was particularly aware of the ways in which our stories have either been erased or pushed aside. And in this case, the mystery is not only about what happened to Ruthy, but who Ruthy is,
Yeah.
right? And who these women are.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it brings up this idea of erasure in a way, and I'm wondering what is it, or what was it like for you to not see yourself represented in books for that period of time that you said where just kind of there was no Puerto Rican representation?
It's so funny because I remember as a teenager going into bookstores and like really looking for books by Puerto Rican authors, and I couldn't. It just like did not. I mean, there was Esmeralda Santiago, there was Down These Mean Streets,
Mm.
right? And then you couldn't really find those voices, but they existed, right? Judith
Yeah.
Ortiz Coffer was getting published out of Arte Publico Press. I was just talking to Gabi Baez, who's at Arte Publico, about this, about being like a teenager and finding Silent Dancing, which was
Mm.
one of her books. It was like this memoir, and just reading it over and over again, and being really inspired by that. But it was very hard to find work
Yeah.
by Puerto Rican authors in like I'm trying to Walden Books, and like I mean I'm dating myself a little bit, but
No, I
like
remember. Well, it's like when people were like borders, and I've said that. And
yeah,
people would
I
be
know,
like,
right?
"Sorry, what is that?" And I'm like, "Ooh, oops."
Yeah, it's wild though. Those bookstores just got ate up,
Just
right?
gone.
Yeah. So, but you wouldn't find those voices there,
Mm.
and so um I think it's really wonderful to again have this moment where so many Puerto Rican writers are getting play.
Yeah. I have a similar experience too. It doesn't feel that way now, but as a Nigerian American person, I did like to read books that were based in Nigeria or just talked about the experience in general. And for so long, it was Things Fall Apart, which is a classic, of course. And then I think the next book I read by a Nigerian author at the time was Under the Udala Trees, which is another favorite of mine too. But then there was a long period where seeing names that I know on books was not something that I saw often until, I mean, now it's completely different. And it makes me so happy to see that my experiences can be written in these ways. Because, you know, it's, I think healing is the word I want to use, but also validating to see yourself in a book that other people are reading and that other people love.
And to think also, too, I think about what are the forms that I think about the ways in which, for example, Puerto Rican authors that I've read have challenged the way I've thought about story or learned about story in, for example, the M.F.A. workshop at Vanderbilt, right? Like, and how you can, and how reading widely from lots of different places invigorates your sense of storytelling and challenges also how you think about form and how stories are told, you know.
And in knowing that, as you wrote this book, have you noticed any shifts in the ways that you view yourself or your identity?
Interesting. Not so much in identity, but I think in sense of self, you know, because the book got a lot of play, and I think that was very strange for me because this book also, you know, it was talking about a lot of stuff that was difficult. And I realized that I think people don't talk enough about how when you're a writer that it's actually incredibly terrifying. You know, when your book comes out, they're like, aren't you so excited? You know, but there was also a lot of feelings, you know, just having your book out in the world. And so I think I really wanted to like sort of protect myself you know, afterwards to like just focus on the writing, right? And not the spin. You know, one of my mentors, Kwame Das, who was my professor at University of Nebraska, one of the things he says, which I love, and I've mentioned this before, but is, you know, don't believe the hype, even if it's about you, you know, right? Like you have to protect that space inside of yourself for your stories without thinking about the spin and the marketing and all that other stuff. So I've been thinking about that a lot in terms of sense of self.
Yeah. And I think something that I was thinking about prior today that we spoke about when I first met you is how social media and media in general plays a role in books and publishing and all the things that we know it to be. I think you know, as someone that has like, I mean, 1 foot in, 1 foot out, I've noticed that there's been a big shift in books that are successful and then that books that maybe don't get enough shine. And what does that mean for these stories and these writers? And you made the decision to not be on social media.
That's right. Yeah.
Which I think is almost, it feels like a requirement now for authors when it never used to be.
Yeah. You know, and I it was kind of late in the, you know, because it was around September that I think I had slowly gotten off of things. Like I got rid of Instagram first. Twitter I've been wanting to get off of for a minute. And then I was like, oh, this is great. Now I can make my exit because everybody's leaving, right? So it doesn't matter. It's becoming irrelevant.
Such a scary place. Yeah. But there's some gems there on Twitter, but it's a scary place.
I mean, what I miss from Twitter is like, you know, like reading, like on Twitter, you could really stumble upon a book that, you know, that may be, you know, published in Chile or something like this, right? And then everybody's like, yeah, this book is really good. And then, you know, you can, you read it, right? But you might not see that in your bookstore. Yeah. And so, and so I miss kind of that discovery element. If you follow the right people, you can get these recommendations that you would never have before. But I don't miss, I guess I just like, I don't miss the bullshit, right? Like I don't miss Like, why, sometimes you'll be on social media, like, why am I reading this? Like, it's 20 minutes later. I don't
like,
care
what?
whether this woman is with this man, like, I don't care. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And I could have been reading a book. So I don't miss that.
Yeah.
But yeah, I made that choice, but I think it's been really good too for the writing, because and I'm also really busy. I have a kid.
Mm-hmm.
And so every single moment I have to be intentional about what am I doing with that, because sometimes I only get 2 hours to myself a day.
Right.
You know?
And why use it kind of just like mindlessly looking at things, or to me it's like absorbing so many different ideas and thoughts that aren't yours on a day-to-day that most of us do anyways.
Sometimes we're consuming junk content. That's the thing, right? So
and I think something that we talked about too is when the book came out, What Happened to Ruthy Ramirez, people would tag you in their thoughts about the book. And I find that to be strange, for lack of a better term.
I'm always grateful when somebody reads a book, but I think there's also this like feeling of, I'm a very anxious person to begin with, and so whenever it's like there's a notification, I'm like, oh, what is that? Oh God, I hope is it
good? Is it bad?
Crazy? Yeah, right. And I mean, and though I had a lot of great responses to the books, I had a lot of racist responses to the book too, which were, and and I think that part of getting off of social media was like sort of, protecting myself from those things too. I just didn't like how available we are to people who you don't know, and and that's not to say I don't mind when somebody's kind and respectful, like I love your book, whatever, but I don't like how like right now, social media makes it so that people feel like they can know everything about you,
and that's have complete access into your life, right? It's, as someone that is on social media and is like a consumer of it, I think it's so scary in a lot of different ways. I'm using this as an example, but I saw a video. There's someone on TikTok, and his whole thing is being able to pinpoint where people are so that they understand the dangers of them posting in real time, where they are, where they're going, and how easily it is for people to find them. And I'm like, I know people think this is funny, but that's actually terrifying.
Yeah.
He was able, from a video I watched, he was able to pinpoint what hotel someone was at based off of the dishware that they were eating from room service.
Yeah, listen, I don't know if you remember this. Who was the Black woman scholar who went to a conference and posted that she was going to a conference, and then somebody targeted her son while she was away from the house? I
don't remember that. That sounds scary.
Yeah, I'm blanking out on her name, but I saw, this was years ago though, but I remember seeing that and I was like, oh, this place is messed up, right? Like there's something really, I mean, there's something really troubling about people like following you to know where you go and then targeting your child. Like, it's just ridiculous. But anyway, but exactly like you're saying.
And I think for me, so the ways that you talked about using social media for books is how I use it too. And I love being able to be on top of like books that are coming out, or maybe books that I've never seen or heard of. There's so many books I found from Instagram, for instance, that I would have never been aware of unless somebody because somebody posted it. That's the way I was. One book I'm thinking about is Small Joys by Elvin James Mensah. God. That book, I didn't hear about it. I hadn't seen it until I was on Instagram one day. I was like, well, this sounds interesting. One of my favorite books of all time, for sure. So that's the positive, I would say. But there's, I think, a lot of pressure I see on authors to post and to engage with people on the internet for success. In their book. And you have taken an active step away from that. And I admire that.
Oh, thank you.
I do. I think it's a way for you to protect yourself mentally, like you said. And I'm wondering, what other ways have you been practicing any sort of activities or things that help you stay grounded mentally, but also kind of help you creatively as well, too?
I read a lot, and I read people that I admire. I'm reading Sefiata and Kwame Das, and right now this Puerto Rican author Maria Arroyo Cruzado. She used to write under Maria Arroyo Shigagi, but I was reading her because I'm working on her bio for a project that we're doing with the University of Houston over here,
Oh, wow.
the Puerto Rican Literature Project, which is this digital archive. And so I was interviewing her, and I just am so inspired by her. She's just amazing. One of the things as I was interviewing her, she kept on saying things that stuck out to me. Like for example, she's a teacher, she's a professor as well. And she's like, a lot of times professors don't like to teach freshman comp. She's like, I love it because it's their first entrance into the academic world. And one of the things that she had said was, one of the questions I like to ask them is, who hurt you in writing? Who hurt you as a writer?
Gosh, yeah. I was like, ooh.
Yeah, right. And I was like, yes, right? Because like we don't think of the page. We do, but I don't think it gets talked about as a page as something that can be a painful moment, right?
It can,
even getting something back, as a ninth grader, and then it's torn up with like marks and stuff like that.
Black and things are crossed out.
So I just think she's great. And she was talking also about the ghazal as like as a way for lots of people of color to tell their stories in a nonlinear way, right? And I thought that was so interesting. So yeah, I try to like nurture myself with writers who I admire, and who are really doing the work, and then it inspires me to get back to the page. But I'm also a mom, and I'm not always great about self-care, so I'm still learning, and trying to get better at it. Do you have good tips?
I mean, yes, right. I always have good tips. You're off to a great start. I think reading in general as a writer is so important. I know that a lot of writers don't like to read while they're writing because they are afraid of, any sort of influence. But I think it's so important to keep that part of you alive, even as a writer, because there's something. Reading is what drew you to writing in the first place, so why let it go? Yeah. So I would say that for sure. And it seems like you're building community, which I think is another great way of taking care of ourselves and
building
having
community.
These moments where people around us are able to remind us of who we are, even in times when we're feeling confused or frustrated. So I think you're doing great there too.
Yeah, I think community is so important.
Same.
Because I think it in terms of writing, like sometimes you need to feel safe, and also to have other readers who are really rooting for you too. There are a lot of people who say they're rooting for you, but they're not.
It's a little weird. The energy's a little off, and you're like, okay, are you actually excited?
Even some
for
people
me?
On social media. So like, there's you get people who
I see it.
Who be like, oh, that's great, and really they're like, I don't think she deserves that.
Right. Like that should have been me.
That should have been me. So, and I try to stay away from that energy as much as possible.
That energy is, once you're able to see that it's not about you, I think it's easier to let it go, but it still stings a little bit, and from what you mentioned, you have such a nice community of authors who are also Puerto Rican who get what the process is like and who are rooting for you genuinely because they care about you.
Yeah, that's it. I was very fortunate for that. Like we have a good circle, a good tight circle. Yeah.
And something I was thinking about is, do you write for yourself?
Oh, yeah, always. I think that I have to write for myself first, and then I can think about where it's going to go after that. Because there are a lot of pressures, I think, even within the publishing industry, to write the type of stories that might be palatable to, audiences, and namely white audiences, right? I was lucky enough to have an editor who, like, avoided that, right? Like, who said you can write what you need to write. But those pressures are always there.
Yeah.
And I think that, resisting them as much as possible is important. And one way to do that is by focusing on, forget about when this becomes a book, whether your agent likes it, whether your editor likes it, whether it's going to sell, whether, all of this stuff, what do you want to write?
Yeah.
And I really admire authors like Victor Laval, for example, who do this, because he's just constantly, he doesn't get boxed in. He'll do whatever genre he wants. When hard. At first he was like realist, you know, with I still remember I have an old copy of Slapboxing with Jesus when it first came
Wow.
out. And I loved that book so much. I read it to, you know, like it's just torn apart.
Right.
And then, you know, he came, and then there's like Big Machine and like, you know, of course, the one that's the Changeling, and then there's and now there's Lone Woman,
Lone
right?
Woman,
It just
yeah.
keeps on, he just keeps on moving and working in whatever genre fits him, and I
Yeah.
love that.
Yeah. Yeah. Is that something that you want for yourself? That freedom to write however you want to?
Most definitely, most definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah, I never want to get boxed in. I think as an artist, you just have to keep on doing what you want.
Yeah.
You know,
I think it's unfair to box artists in personally. And it's very limiting.
Yeah.
Right? But I do think because we live in the world that we do, people want to put you in a particular category because it's easier.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. It's easier to sell.
Yes. Yes.
And that's kind of dangerous,
It
right?
is.
You know, because we can confuse success as the ability to sell in, you know, the way in an environment in which capitalism is so linked to art, and that's the unfortunate part, right?
Yeah. And I think in recognizing that capitalism is, of course, a part of everything that we do, I think it also mostly impacts our identity.
Yeah.
You know, and then not fitting into any of the boxes identity-wise too, right? How has that experience been for you?
Well, I think like as somebody who's of the diaspora, sometimes those are questions. I think this is true of anybody who's diasporic, right? Like you are constantly thinking about how being displaced affects who you are. What does it mean to be Puerto Rican? You know, what does it mean to be really Puerto Rican? How are sometimes those things myths, right? And recognizing that there are many ways to be Puerto Rican. For, you know, a while I was thinking about, I keep on thinking about, for example, language, right? And, you know, my Spanish has never been great. And I always feel, I think, that sense of shame, you know, when I have to speak or I have to be in settings where I have to speak, right? And so, but I think about how the loss of language itself, as somebody who is diasporic, is actually characteristic of somebody who's been affected by colonialism, which is a very Puerto Rican experience, right? And so those are things, and that's even something I examine inside the book, right?
For sure.
And I grew up in a house that was Spanish speaking. You know, my grandmother did not speak English a lot, my great-grandmother, right? And so we were constantly surrounded by Spanish, but even when you're constantly surrounded by Spanish, in a country that's mostly English, the language kind of slips, right?
It does, yeah.
And so that's one way in which I think about how, you know, what is identity. I also think about, you know, the ways that writers kind of challenge fixed identity, and, you know, especially when it comes to nationality, right? Like, and how it's important to be okay with that. There's many ways to be, you know, Puerto Rican or Nigerian, or you know. Yeah, while also respecting that Puerto Ricans in the archipelago have the very specific issues that they're dealing with, you know, right?
No, I mean, as someone that's Nigerian American, I very much so resonate with that, right? I am someone that understands my language. I'm Yoruba, so we speak Yoruba. And I don't speak it because I've been, you know, that anxiety that you feel of like maybe not being able, to me, it's like not being able to switch the language in my brain quickly enough to have a conversation. And that feels shameful. And then now I'm like, okay, I understand the language, but I'm not fluent in it because I don't speak it, but I could speak it, but I'm feeling shame. And so much of that is assimilation, it's colonialism, it's so many of the isms, right? And I feel like language is, like, it's slipping quickly. And that's sad.
Yeah. You know, I'm really interested in what you were saying about like the language switching fast enough, right? And so, and I think about like, I'm comfortable speaking Spanish with my mom or my grandmother when she was alive, or, you know, but whenever it's a place in which I feel like I'm performing, or I have to, like performing in an academic setting, for example, in which people are judging, you know, it's like something freezes inside of me, and I just, you know, I feel like I can't, right? And so I think that that really resonated with me, what you were saying.
I think it's this feeling of not being enough, right? And I'm using it in the sense of like you're in a crowd of strangers, right? And they're expecting you to be fluent Spanish speaking, right? So if you get up there and you stumble, ooh, she's a phony. But it's like, you're not, right? And it's like, you know that consciously, but something in your body is disconnecting.
I love it. And I love what you're saying about the body too. Because even though sometimes be a visceral response, you know? And I think that's so well put.
I think, again, I'm really glad that you mentioned language. I feel like language is it's something that I love. To me, to be sitting and listening to someone like my mom, or even I watch a lot of like old Nigerian movies because I am an old auntie on the inside. I just love the nuances and the drama and the flair as they're speaking. So I'm really glad that you mentioned that. And something that you also have talked about before is like being a part of a cultural experience is balancing between humor and tragedy. I resonated with that deeply because it is. And I think what happens with Ramirez is a great example of that. There's the parts of the book that are ridiculous, but they're so funny. And there's parts of the book that are heartbreaking and absolutely devastating. And you're just kind of doing this in between the two.
And this is this is part of a long history of Puerto Rican literature, which really thinks about which incorporates absurdity, right, with our experiences, you know, and I love to be playful on the page, and I don't think it's just for the book. I think that in reality that we use humor to cope with a lot of fucked up things that happen to us, and I want to honor that as well. And at the same time, I talk about this too, that like, sometimes the characters use humor to deflect. Well, specifically, I'm thinking of Nina, for example, to deflect what is painful. And so I also challenge when humor is used to sort of escape earnestness, right? When is it important to be honest about what we're feeling, you know? But I think that I always, somebody was like, why did you decide to write this funny? I was like, I didn't decide it. That was the only way I could write it.
Right. You're right. It's not really a conscious decision most times. And I think what you're mentioning about us kind of leaning on humor in dark times is something that I see on social media all the time. I mean, we're constantly going through tragedy, sadly. All the time. We're in a constant state of grief. And, you know, what is it like to just allow yourself to laugh at something that's funny, even if it's just for a minute, even if it's for 2 minutes? You know, is there harm in bringing in humor to dark times?
I think it's incredibly important.
In saying that as well, I think the perfect example that you use is reality TV, which as a fan, I loved that part because I talk about reality TV all the time. People find it to be interesting that I am such a fan since I'm a therapist and I'm not allowed to be funny or like things that aren't, you know, strict. But I think reality TV serves a lot of things if you really sit and look at it. And you talk about that often.
I was interested in like how reality TV can be used as a vehicle to pose really two questions. One, which is the premise, like, is this Ruthy, right? But then also the second question, which is, are these real representations of these women, right? And what is performance? What is real? And thinking about also like critically about the ugly versions of the ugly parts of reality TV, which are like, when do Black and brown women's bodies become sites of violence for entertainment, you know? While also thinking about like, why do we get so addicted to it, right? And then, and there's one part in the book where I think it's in Jessica's part. She was like, well, sometimes you just want to see people scream when throughout the day you had to be quiet, right? Like, and
you want to see someone flip a table,
yeah,
and throw something because you can't.
When women are taught that they can't, have rage or enact it, especially Black and brown women, right? Like you have to be this other way in order to, get paid, keep your job, be respectable, all this bullshit, right? And so I think that I wanted to really explore that inside of the book. And reality TV is a really good way to explore identity too.
I 100% agree. I try to tell
bingo.
people that all the time, and you nailed it on the head.
Yeah.
I think it's also a great exploration of so many of the things that we see on the day to day. Like there's some reality shows that I watch. I won't name them, or maybe I will. Where they discuss or they avoid the topic of colorism. So violently.
Yes.
Where it's like, as a viewer, we're like, you are clearly treating this dark-skinned Black woman differently, and yet you keep saying that you aren't. And it's like, okay, so then...
over and over again. Top Model, Bad Girls Club,
all of it.
Over and over again.
And they tried to address it on this show. It's a Real Housewives franchise. They tried to address it in their reunion, and it was horrible.
Oh.
They maybe spent a minute
seen this one.
talking about it.
Wow.
And that was it. And the only person that was talking was a dark-skinned Black woman, and all the other very light-skinned women were like, well, we find it hurtful that you think that we're colors.
And they turn it back on them.
Yeah, and it became like, then they started crying, and it was like,
and it's reenacting
happening?
That violence that white women actually do. Correct. I mean, it's terrifying, but I think that that's a really important observation about how TV works. I mean, because I especially I think about, I'm thinking of the 90s and the early 2000s, because that's when
that's when reality TV was.
Yeah. And that's when it was
at its prime, I think.
At its prime, when it was when people were just really about it, but also when the actual shows were the most problematic,
the most.
I remember oh God, in Top Model, they when Tara Banks was telling this young lady that she was too ghetto, right? Do you remember that one?
Yes, when she was like, ghetto, classy.
Yeah.
Why was she speaking like that?
Or when she shaved back this woman's hairline. There were just ridiculous violences that were done on these shows, and
we just watched it.
It was normalized.
It was so normal.
It was normalized.
I tried to go back and rewatch America's Next Top Model as a full, functioning adult, because we were young and didn't know anything at the time. I was like, I can't believe that this show was allowed. It was so impressionable. The women that they were calling plus size were size 8.
I know, that's wild to me. It's wild to me.
And I remember thinking at the time when the show premiered, I was like, yeah, they're plus size. Yeah, I can see that.
That's wild to me. Somebody was, one of my colleagues, she's so funny. She had said, she was like, the real injustice of Real Women Have Curves is that they had us think that this woman was fat, and she wasn't. Like the teenage girl, what was it, America Ferrer?
Yes,
Yeah.
Ugly Betty.
Oh, she had. I mean, but it's so crazy that you look back on those moments and you're just like, wow, how did this fly?
I always ask people, in knowing that we were so impressionable as a society at the time, how have you spent life now unlearning some of those things that were so normal to us? Again, like being a size 8 was considered plus size, and this idea of beauty only looking one particular way, right? How do you kind of navigate and challenge that on a day-to-day? I mean,
I think it'll forever be a process of unlearning. Especially, I had my child. I gained a lot of weight after I had my child. My body had changed, and I sometimes I'll say things like, oh, right, well, when I get back, to what I was, And my sister actually is really good at this. She was like, well, Claire, you may never get back, and that's okay.
Right.
Right? It is okay to be who you are. You had a whole child, right? And you have to honor that, right?
Yeah.
And so I think it takes time to learn a lot of that toxicness. But I also think writing is really good for that, you know.
Really?
I wonder, because as a therapist, I know sometimes people get told to like write journals and you can see patterns. And I think that writing helps you like see where you have troubling patterns, and you kind of keep on believing the same thing, right?
Yes, and I'm glad that you mentioned that. A lot of people don't really resonate with journaling, but I think the pattern aspect of it is something that I value as a person that is a therapist and also a person in the world. You are able to see those patterns, and then when you're writing some of those negative beliefs that you have towards yourself, you're like, ooh, that's a bit harsh. Like, can I change this? Like, can I address it? And then it becomes more prevalent in your mind instead of a passing thought that feels true.
One troubling thing that I had, for example, was whenever something good would happen, I would get very anxious and think something bad's going to happen. I'm like, well, or I would qualify, like, well, it's good for now. We'll see what happens.
Right, like I'm just waiting for the other shoe.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so you never really take the moment to enjoy the thing because you're so scared of it leaving, you know? And, and that's, somebody had told me, they were like, that's a trauma response, you know? Like you're constantly thinking something bad is going to happen, or that when good things happen, you kind of don't deserve it, right? And, but that came through writing. Really thinking about like what I, and before I go to bed, what are the things that when I'm really honest to myself, nobody's going to read this. And you just kind of write your thoughts. All of a sudden you start to see what is really happening.
I think even pushing past that vulnerability takes a lot of courage. Even if knowing no one's going to see it, right? You have to sit and confront yourself and these things that aren't so pretty, right? And something I was thinking about as you were talking is you had such a big success with your book, right? Were you just always at the edge of your seat, kind of waiting for, something to happen, right? How did you work through that?
Oh, man. Because I feel like when there were really good moments, I also was like, well, something always happens that's wrong, so something will happen, you know? But how I worked through that was like friends, like you saw Linda, like I have a group chat with my good friends Linda Garcia Merchant and Christy Hyman, and we talk throughout the day, every single day, and about everything, and they remind me every day, you deserve this, you are good, and we remind each other that like, because the truth is, to navigate this world, you're constantly being told that you're not enough, right? And you need people who are by your side who tell you that you are. Yeah.
And believing them.
And believing them. Most definitely.
Eventually you start to believe it yourself. I don't know when. I think it depends on the person, of course. But sometimes you're like, I need that extra like push, right? What are some ways that you affirm yourself on a day-to-day?
Oh, I'm trying to do this gratitude journal, which sounds really hokey, but I
love a gratitude journal. It's not hokey. I try to tell people our world is spinning so quickly. Things are happening so fast. If you can take some time to really sit and be like, okay, here's what I feel excited and grateful for the day. Why not?
I find there's in one part of it, it's like write an affirmation, and I'll try to change it throughout the day. But one that I think about is like, you're doing, especially I think this really gets connected back to motherhood, and it's like I try to remind myself you're doing so much, and you are doing it well. Like just, and even if you have a mess up, that's okay because you're doing enough at this moment.
Yeah. And sometimes it's just that simple of like, you're doing enough and that's okay. You don't have to add anything else. Something that I was thinking about that I like to ask people is, what would the younger version of Claire who didn't see herself represented in books think about where you are right now?
Oh, man. I think she would be really surprised and really happy. She would... I mean, I don't think, I mean, being a professor, having a book that's published, I don't think that would have ever, I mean, it would have been a hope, but I'm not sure that I would have been confident that would have happened. I didn't really have anything that I specifically wanted to do. I know my parents always wanted me to be an engineer, like classic,
yeah, lawyer,
like
doctor.
yeah.
Yeah, I know it.
And then I was like, what I do well is right, and so, but I didn't see a pathway towards having a book in a bookstore.
Yeah.
And so for it to happen, I think she would be very happy about that.
For sure. I think, I know people say it all the time, but that is why representation matters.
Yeah.
If you don't see yourself somewhere, how do you know it's possible?
Yeah, absolutely.
I hope that you are able to now rest a bit and stay in the moments of excitement that are coming for you and that are happening for you right now.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I'm going to think about that. I'll carry that throughout the week.
Amazing. All right.